but for
Recording in progress.
but for a lot of other things. And thank you again for the invitation. As we said, as you read in my we started this project of building virtual laboratories in 2009. So that was when I had just joined Amrita, and a colleague of mine, Professor Krishnashree Achudan, she started working with some top universities across the country to actually create an initiative that was launched by the government of India as a funded initiative to build virtual labs. And these virtual lab tools is what we love today. What we did is that the government, when it came to funding, said, you know, you need to build tools that makes people autonomous. Students should be able to learn in free of time. And initially in 2009, remember India, I can recall that India had around 480 million mobile phone users, and today if you look at it, we are nearly 1.12 billion mobile phone users, and that covers approximately only 78% of our population. So given that number, the government said, okay, if you build tools, make sure it's open source, it's free, and it's easily adaptable even in the absence of a teacher. So this was a thing that we started off as what we call as our virtual labs. And the India angle involved that when you develop a content, whether be it animation or a simulation or a remote trigger, a remotely established experiment, which you can trigger from a web interface, these experiments came with their own modules, such as theory module, procedure modules. So basically a kind of an electronic lab manual for things that we thought was a supplement to or complement students who were not having teachers. So this is how the virtual lab project started. As I said, initially when we started, we had these three modalities of experiments: animations where we couldn't use complicated math, simulations where we could use simple math and deliver web-based simulations, and we had remotely controlled equipment that people could trigger over the internet. Of course, in 2013, when we started asking us question about scale up and testing beyond at the level of deployment, we removed the remotely controlled experiments because we couldn't scale up to the number of users that we were having. Just to give you a small picture before I do that, so this is a very well established project that we've been doing since 2009, and we are around 12 partners, government partners, top technological universities, some universities like us, joining in together with a very interdisciplinary approach with the developer goals that the content will be in an LMS. It will be catered to undergraduate and postgraduate students doing courses in India or doing courses at the level, want to do courses in India and want to learn at their own pace and at their own curiosity, and an access that would allow them to do things beyond the class hours or exam time that we would do. In fact, all these lab experiments that I'm talking about, we have nearly, as a national initiative, it's approximately 1,100 experiments that we are online, and all of them are free on vlab.co.in, the national website. And if you come to our Amrita contributions, which I'll show on the next page, we have a similar version of it also on our university page, which is vlab.amrita.edu. I like to add the fact that it's a huge team in Amrita, in our university, building these virtual labs. What some of us do is to channel this into a direction. So there's no one developer, but a big team working together, and we enjoy the fact of it. In fact, when all these universities got together, we decided that we would take engineering education in India as a template to start building labs that would cater to the undergraduate bachelor's in engineering or bachelor's in technology students and others. And that's how we defined these 9 disciplines. We called it, for example, biotechnology and biomedical is something that I coordinate for the country, and the rest of it having different partners from different partner institutions. And it's a very nice project as it is, that you will see when you check out some of our experiments on the websites that are freely available. These experiments are free, student users can use it. Most of the experiments are browser based, so there is no server client. Most likely it will be just a client only interface, and so on and so forth. Our personal experience, that is the value project, otherwise the virtual Amrita Laboratories Universalizing Education, is this group of experiments that we are talking. I'm just using the word lab The terminology lab in our definition implies a set of experiments that can be considered as a part of a syllabi. So each lab would have 8 to 12 experiments depending on what curriculum it matches. So we build these labs in these different domains to begin with, and we are still scaling up. We are still building them. Of course, we are not building them in the same speed that we used to do pre-COVID. Since this is a conference dedicated to chemistry education, I would love to say this is our global perspective of chemistry education that we see. We have nearly 760,000 users using chemistry labs and 3.49 million sessions being used on our chemistry virtual labs. And this is something that a colleague of mine, Dr. Vaishag, also did as his PhD study, working with us developing and deploying these virtual labs. I'll give you some examples. I won't go into the details because the talk is very short. We found out through our experiences in the last, let's say 2010 to 2019, that animations were critical, where we found there was no data, or the data was too complex to create, and a teacher-student information transfer was crucial. And if you remove the teacher, you will see some of these questions come up. During COVID, for example, there were several teachers not able to teach, and we found that undergraduate students would sit and do labs and tell us where they were failing or where they could repeat things to learn what they didn't know. Animations were very critical in suggesting how and what the environment would look like. So for example, in some of our experiments like gel electrophoresis, you'll see that they can perform the things as if they're doing in a real lab. So the know-how was transferred and not the exact value or the outcome of the condition. When we did simulations, we built math simulators. So for example, a neuroscience student would ask us a question: what happens if I apply tetrodotoxin to a sampled neuron, and so on and so forth. So simulations were very critical, where we found students asking us where the data or methods need to be reproduced, or they took notes. We saw a lot of divergent behavior from Kolb's learning model in such scenarios. We also saw that remotely triggered labs, remotely controlled labs, which we do not develop anymore, were very critical when we wanted, let's say, people to have original data. At a very beginner's level, we saw a lot of school students actually very motivated using a remotely triggered lab. But one of the problems we had was inability to scale up to the millions and tens of millions of students who would want to use it, especially during examination season. So that was a major issue, and that was one of the reasons we actually had to pull it down, although in some scale we could repeat some of these experiments even today. We also did, as part of this national program, we also implemented what is called a nodal center program. It really helps. As a university, you feel that training students outside just your university background, or conducting workshops or training sessions on tools, are very, very powerful dissemination methods. And in fact, our nodal center program got recognized for a lot of nice stories. We got an award from the OLAB consortium, and what we did is to establish institutions that would love to co-develop or to train their students to use these tools. And this is the trend that I'm showing you for the last 10 years, where we increased the number of institutions participating with us. They gave us inputs, they changed content, they made more usage values. For example, running a survey was so easy. Instead of getting 60 students, we would get 1,100 students in such approaches. And this is an example of how approach works. And in all these studies, we found out that the goals of learners are usually very different from the models themselves. So even building a simplified version of a tool doesn't imply that, for example, a computer-aided drug design tool doesn't imply that they know the drug design process. So the learners' goals were quite often different when they came into virtual lab environment. And this challenged us in a different way. And we started asking questions early in the process of developing virtual labs: which features were good, what was appreciated. We ran technology acceptance model surveys and OER surveys, online educational resources surveys, and found that many students would write to us, would tell us in their comments that improved student performance was a key factor. We even had students who would not cross the threshold of the passing mark in certain courses, come back and take it, and then go back and say, okay, I got it better. So this was very, very critical for us early in the years. And this is a case study by my colleague, Dr. Vaishak, Kanikoil, Dr. Professor Krishnashree and me. One of the things in chemistry was alternate conception, the idea of planarity and phenomena. We constructed what is called a molecular symmetry alternate conception test, and we did it on students performing virtual labs and students who were not performing virtual labs, and we saw a significant difference when a student goes through the process of emulating the scenario through an animation or through a skill or through a my hypothesis is always based on the fact that no virtual lab can replace a real teacher or a real lab. So these are just educational tools in the process of, so our questions showed that those who went through for a scientifically correct concept were more precise in the way they understood their problem statement. This led to us doing several other things. We analyzed the model of learning inside these virtual environments, virtual experiments, 200 of them or so, using Kolb's model, and we found out that 60% of the Kolb's people were typically let's say assimilators or divergers, very few were accommodators. Probably this gave us the idea that we should also assess reflective thinking. In fact, we did a study, I hope it's there, but before that let me come back. This is when we didn't know a decade into virtual lab development, and we didn't expect COVID to block us out completely. So just to give you a fact and factorial, before COVID, India is supported to have 488 million mobile phones. This year, we are 1.12 billion mobile phones. It just shows you that things have changed drastically across people and the way people have used digital technology. What used to cost, let's say, 50 cents, 60 cents per gigabyte of data is now less than $13 for every gigabyte of data. In fact, there are schemes that makes a lot of the country more accessible. This started giving us pressure. In fact, one thing that we noticed is that a large amount of people, this was a work published in Springer EAIT, where we looked at what happened during COVID. We realized that there was a lot of similarities in the trend. Countries would shut down based on COVID, the country, I'm talking about Indian users, and we saw a very high increase in the number of new registrations and new usages, which we never had pre-COVID. In pre-COVID, it was the Nodal Center program pushing usage for us. After COVID, we wanted, of course, Nodal Center is doing it during COVID, but immediately when the lockdowns were getting over, we still saw a very high number of people learning content, complementing their knowledge content using virtual labs, and that's where we think the trend is going to remain. We think a part of it will mean that a small group of students are going to ask you for interactive textbooks. I'll come back in a short while. We also did, I'm rushing through because there's a very little, so we did a reflective learning study a year ago. It was published in Computers in Education, and we also saw that perception changes are very, very drastic before and after. That is, let's say pre-COVID and soon after COVID. I wouldn't say much after COVID, but soon after COVID. I call it the immediate post-COVID period. I wouldn't talk about much, but we also saw studies where reflective learning, these virtual platforms, so there were two things that surprised us. One is what happens if you introduce virtual lab as a content before the real lab and after the real lab. It's surprising. In reality, real laboratory education should promote a lot, but we found out, at least in India, I believe, I don't know how much it changes everywhere across the globe, we found out that when you provide virtual labs as a learning step before the real lab, before the physical laboratory, here in this case the control V is virtual and P is physical, you'll see that the students who did virtual lab just before the physical lab actually performed better and had performance scores on metacognition, analogical reasoning and transfer of knowledge slightly better than the students, very slightly. So I wouldn't say very critically. In fact, variances are very high in these studies. But this is something that we found online environments can do to education, specifically chemistry education, or looking at properties in standard techniques. So what do we see? What do we tell today? Um, for students, today's virtual laboratories or virtual experiments are highly interactive textbooks. They are the way many of our students, I don't know about the rest of the world, but I'll tell you, in India, textbook usage has gone down in when I give class notes, and we see people love to have interactivity with their content. So we see virtual labs as online textbooks. We also see that there is a hybrid behavior coming in, and there is a lot of teacher impact in these kind of studies, teacher perception in these studies, which means what we had as questions, like for example in the past teachers would ask us, did we have a concern about a virtual lab replacing a real lab? I think that kind of fear has completely shifted post COVID. We also have seen that people would love to make mistakes, especially we have a tool called MedSim where we do case studies for medical students. MedSim is developed by my colleague Dr. Prema, and we see medical students love that platform because they can make mistakes. They can, sorry to use the word, virtually kill a patient, which they can't do in a real world. This is a trend that is catching up, is changing the way we look at usage and behavior. I'll stop very soon.
Oh, Sean? Nikita, can you still hear Sean?
I can hear you, but I can't hear
Oh no.
Shyam.
Okay. Is this, I suppose it's an internet problem, maybe
Yes,
for him then.
I
Which
think
is very,
so.
very sorry. Maybe let's really you know, when you look at the time schedule, we try to move on a little bit and let's see if he jumps in. And then
Yes.
Sean, can you hear us? You were disconnected, right? Sean? Sean?
Can
Can
you
you hear?
hear me? I'm sorry, I got a internet drop for a second. I think there was a
Yes,
lightning strike.
yes. I would suppose now because we have to move on with our Skype time schedule that you will keep push the discussion into the chat. And what would be even great is because you showed so many papers, so many data. Please put some DOIs into the chat, and people will, you know, jump onto your papers, and then they can read us questions, maybe.
I'll definitely do that. So in a big pictures, we have seen teachers are pro virtual labs after the pandemic. Students are less pro after the pandemic. Just giving you that. I'm going to stop with that. And Andreas and team, Nikita, Alex, everyone, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm sorry
Yes.
to have jumped time.
We're
Thank you
really
so much.
impressed by the huge research program, and I'd be happy to read more about it. I'm sure this goes for all the people here in the room. Thanks, Sean. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. So, time for us to transition on over a little bit, still in the realm of virtual labs, to Shalonda. So, Shalonda is an assistant professor of STEM education and educational technology at the University of Tennessee. With a PhD in curriculum and instruction, her research focuses on learning in virtual environments. I must say, I saw Shalonda's paper and kind of fangirled a little bit because I was really excited to hear about Shalonda's research because that's kind of similar to what I do, except I do it like not in the virtual space. So Shalonda is a XR designer and STEM ed scholar. She explores how to enhance learning experiences in diverse STEM contexts using theories of learning experience design and disciplinary literacy. So Dr. Reeves is dedicated to fostering inclusivity and diversity inside of STEM education. And with that, I'll hand it on over to Shalonda.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Let me see if I can share properly. Can I get a thumbs up if you guys can see it? Looks good.
See it.
All right, there we go. All right, so I really want to talk about centering the learner in the design, development, and implementation of virtual laboratories. A lot of my work is kind of stemmed around this particular quote, which says, the goal of research is to thoroughly understand what occurs in the laboratory and then work on revising curriculum and pedagogy. I'm really all about the nuance. I'm about the learner experience and centering their needs in my work. And a lot of the studies that I've looked at, which I'll kind of talk about, it has a very content-driven perspective, like what do they need to know? And it's like, well, what do they need? So let's get a little bit into it. And so from that, I'm really interested in how can a virtual environment be designed, implemented, and properly measured, because we all know measurement matters in supporting the learner experience. And so what I did was, I have a few words that I want to just clarify for everybody in here. So when I say 2D, see if it'll come up. Come on, there we go. 2D, 3D, I mean what's actually happening, first person technology experience. When I say virtual labs, I'm talking about being able to manipulate in a virtual environment. So whether you're a headset or a desktop, I'm kind of talking about it all when I use the word virtual laboratory. And then a VR lab in this instance would be someone simulating an experience that they would definitely have in a actual lab in a virtual environment. And so you see the lady here at the top, she is pipetting, but then in the virtual laboratory, they are also pipetting. So it's that simulation of a real world experience. And so I conducted a systematic review, which I'm going to talk about very briefly, just to kind of give you a little understanding. Virtual labs are usually looked at from an inquiry perspective, most consistent with, inquiry-based learning. What are they learning? How are they learning it? But then they're also, it's not clicking good for me. All right. And so also, there is no real consistent perspective that individuals are kind of looking at virtual laboratories through. They're looking at it to see if it can be akin to a teacher, instructional formats. The gentleman just talked about blended flipped learning. And then interventions. Can it replace? Should it replace? Those are kind of the big questions that individuals are asking when they look for or when they are publishing on VR labs. And then interpretation. Well, most of the research is not grounded or lacks grounding in how they're understanding or interpreting the results in actual learning theories, because I'm all about how people learn, and learning theories help us understand that. So I really was kind of interested in what are people actually measuring. And so as you see, knowledge and understanding, of course, is the biggest measurement that people actually reported on, followed by using surveys and questionnaires. But what I found very interesting is that the perception being assessed, juxtaposed to actual interviews and observations, didn't quite match. So people were asking perceptions and students' perceptions, but they were never actually talking to the students. They never really saw what the students were doing. They typically had surveys or questionnaires, which leaves a lot of nuance out there, or a lot of sameness that ends up being the focal point versus looking at the varied experiences that students have, which leads to my research question. How do undergraduate students enrolled in a general chemistry laboratory course conceive learning a virtual laboratory? A virtual laboratory. And so I use phenomenography, Martin 81, because really it's looking at understanding experiences about the world around them. My favorite thing about phenomenography is that it really doesn't ask a lot of leading questions intentionally. So instead of saying, how did you like the virtual laboratory? Which assumes the person actually liked the virtual laboratory. It really asks, what is your experience with the virtual laboratory? And so it does not reveal statements about the world, but people's conception. So I'm not really trying to say, this is how the students feel about, this is how all students, right? So I'm really trying to move away from students as a monolith. They are not. They are varied individuals. They come with different conceptions. And so I really wanted to be able to pick that up. And so my research question, of course, I use semi-structured interviews because I saw that was typically not utilized or underutilized, let me say that, when actually trying to understand students' conception. And again, if it was utilized, it was really talking and thinking about students more as a monolith and not looking at the varied student experience. And so I use phenomenography as my form of analysis. And so I did have a participant sampling. So what we did was we had students, undergraduate students from a large general chemistry class, and they had 3 laboratories that they had to engage with, virtual laboratories. So what we did to identify the participants is in the first lab, we gave them an exit survey. And the exit survey just asks various questions like their background, what ethnicity, demographic questions, their perspective of the virtual laboratory. And so to identify the participants in the purposive sample, they each completed the exit, and then the participant pool was derived from there. So we intentionally picked what we assumed was a variety of students. So we picked students who typically had, that did not come from the same background. Hold on, sorry, it's not clicking right. So all the participant pools that completed the survey, they were grouped according to their identified perspective. So whether they had a positive, neutral, or negative perspective of the virtual lab. And then the surveys were grouped according to the gender within their respective categories. So we tried to have 1 male and 1 female participant, and hopefully from different ethnicities, we tried if possible. And then we also tried to have students that had different majors. And so again, this is just looking at the varied perspective of students. And then from this group, 6 participants were identified with 1 male and 1 female represented in each for each perspective. And so again, using phenomenography as our method of analysis, we tried to identify a set of qualitatively different categories representing variations of individuals' experience of the phenomena, and the phenomena in this case is virtual labs or VR labs. Gonzalez 2010 was applied as a method of analysis. And so I've listed the process of analysis, but I do not want to give the impression that it is sequential in any. It is very iterative. The purpose is to search for a collective meaning of responses called categories and to describe them for each individual person. And so this type of analysis seeks to identify variations, again, the goal of this, and how they relate. The results are displayed in an outcome space, which are illustrative and is an illustrative representation of the results that is logically constructed based on complexity, which I'll show you later, and I'll break it all down. It'll make more sense. But the outcome space can be represented in many formats, but it can be essential. It should entail at least 2 essential elements. And one is a description of the category, and the second is a selection of illustrative statements accompanying each category. So let's look. Oh, did it go back too far? Yep. All right. So we had 4 categories of description. So once we did our analysis, 4 categories really came up. Perceived barriers to learning, perceived affordances of the VR labs, enhanced learning, amount of content knowledge and prior experience influenced learning, and then hindered my ability to learn. And so though these categories represent variation, the perspectives related to these 3 dimensions is quite different. And so I'll illustrate that in an outcome space. All right, so for the outcome space, students came to the experience with a set of expectations, and the collective meaning of their expectations or categories of description could be grouped into dimensions of expectations. So that's what you see as the meet expectations, neither meet nor below expectations, kind of in the middle, and then below expectations. So that's us recognizing that in the responses that the students gave. And then for this study, there were 3 dimensions. The dimensions represent what the students experience or referential. So that's, again, the 3 parts here that you see. And then we have students removed barriers to learning. I'm sorry. Students felt that the VR experience removed barriers to learning. That means it met their expectations. Perceived affordances, that mean, again, met expectation. Amount of content knowledge and or prior experience influenced learning. That was neither below or met expectations. And then below expectations, they felt it hindered their ability to learn. And so you can kind of see how the responses fit on the outcome space. To give you a better understanding of how we kind of analyzed it, you see that how students experience is actually structural. And so students had a more complex conception of the learning, which is removed barriers to learning, all the way down to least complex conception of learning. And this goes into how they talked about it. And so as a conception is more complex, you will see different elements of their perspective kind of build. And I'll show you an example. Sorry. So if you see here, for example, for hindered my ability to learn is a more simplistic conception. And an example of that would be here where the student Helen says, titration is a tool based on, it's a tool-based lab, and there's more than one tool, and there's more than one solution, and there are a lot of different ways, parts and moving parts in that whole. So VR just overcomplicates it. So here, Kellen is describing his experience learning to use the tools for a titration as overcomplicated. And so we would consider that least complex or the not as complex. However, if you look at removed barriers to learning, is the most complex in the hierarchy. And an example of this conception would be if I was in a lab, a physical lab, and I was doing it, I'd probably be trying to rush because everybody else is ahead and I'm trying to get done and I want to learn and I wouldn't learn anything. So here, Kevin describes the experience by referencing the isolation of the VR lab as keeping him focused on learning and the content, as opposed to in a traditional lab where he's usually rushing and completes the assignments in an effort to keep up with his peers. And so the level of complexity increases in the categories. As the categories move from A to D, complexity is determined by how one category is informed by another. And so you will see that here. And so if you look at them side by side, you could see that category 4 is a simplistic conception of learning. Kellen states, the pipetting lab is kind of tedious and not good to learn with virtually. He considers the VR labs to be tedious and not good for learning. However, the description is neither inclusive or complex. However, category 3 reflects the more inclusive and complex conceptions of learning with the VR lab. Carrington states, I would say that just conceptually, because I understood rule structures better, I was more willing to make mistakes because I knew what was happening. But for titrations, I didn't know what was happening and I didn't know how to use the tools, so it was like a conundrum. This statement is inclusive because Carrington's conceptions recognizes that learning titration in the VR lab caused her some difficulty. as well is complex because her statement implies an awareness to the role of her level of content knowledge played and how her level of content knowledge played and how she experienced the VR lab. And so if you look at, sorry. So if you look at the categories, again, from least complex to more complex, you will see that students' perspectives begin to evolve, or the perspectives of students evolved from recognizing how they played a role and just considering the VR lab as the reason why they couldn't understand the perspectives. And so how can virtual environments be designed and properly measured to benefit chemical education? Some of the things that we recognized from our study was that affordances of VR labs are beneficial to learning, but not always used effectively. And so this revealed that students, or how you implement a VR lab, should really align with what you assume students would be able to get from it, and then also take into account the level of content knowledge that your students have prior to getting into the design of the virtual laboratory. Further, rote practices to hinder learning, causing more focus on completing the task than understanding the concepts. Students found that sometimes that rote movement within the virtual lab became more tedious. They didn't like the fact that they would have to do step one in order to do step two, especially if they felt like they had a great sense of, or a good conception of the content. They wanted to be able to move and take more liberties than those students who did not have as good of a understanding of the content knowledge. And then third, VR labs do not have to emulate a physical laboratory. They should be able to fill the gaps students identify in their science education. And so virtual labs do not necessarily have to be a direct replica of what's happening in their undergraduate chemistry class. It can actually begin to contextualize that knowledge beyond the classroom to have actual practical applications in the real world. And so I think it's important, especially what we're seeing in our research from students, is that VR labs need to help them make the connection, especially to what they're learning in their lecture courses. And so how do we kind of bring that together as a full circle moment for students? And then students' views on their learning with a virtual lab is influenced by their level of content knowledge. I think sometimes we really look at, does it work? Well, does it not work? And it was like, well, it depends. It really depends on the student and the level of content knowledge that they have and how it was designed. Was it designed to meet the needs of a particular learner at a particular learning level? And so all of these questions, right, are really important if we're talking about virtual laboratories and how we design them. We usually only focus on the end goal, the outcomes, the knowledge. And it was like, well, if the design isn't done in a way that actually supports the learner, we always say, or my advisor would say, incidental learning leads to unintended outcomes. And so if we are not intentional in the design phase of it, if it's not grounded in literature or theoretical frameworks on how people learn, when you measure the outcomes, you really don't know what you're getting because it was never designed with that in mind. And so I really hope that you guys enjoyed this talk, and I am open to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Shalon.